Welcome to Wasabi Interviews, where we talk to interesting people in Hawaii, Japan, and beyond. My name is Antonio Vega, and today we are joined by Stephen Salel, the Robert F. Lange Foundation Japanese Curator of Japanese Art of the Honolulu Museum of Art. I got it right?
Perfect. Yeah.
Yes. So welcome, Stephen. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Stephen, I've gotten to talk to you multiple times over the past few years through Wasabi. We've done a couple feature stories for the magazine. It's always been a pleasure talking to you and learning about Japanese art. So,
Likewise.
It's good to catch up with you.
Definitely. Good to see you again.
Now, there is something that I'm looking forward to at the museum, and that is the exhibit of perhaps one of the most famous woodblock prints from Japan ever, which is The Great Wave by Hokusai, and I want to discuss that. But before we get to that, I want to give a general idea of like, what is this woodblock print, or in Japanese, sometimes it's called ukiyo-e, and I know the museum has the third largest collection in the United States, which is just amazing. You guys have like an incredible amount of these prints, but what exactly are they? Could you give a little context so that people can have a better understanding of what exactly is a quote unquote woodblock print or ukiyo-e?
Sure. I think that there is a little bit of confusion regarding those terms, and I want to clarify that a little bit. You're right. A lot of times we think of ukiyo-e as synonymous with Japanese woodblock prints. Actually, they're a little bit different, and ukiyo-e is a little bit more like a philosophy or an art historical movement than it is a medium. So woodblock printing in Japan can be dated back quite far to about the 8th century. But the movement we know as ukiyo-e doesn't start until about the 17th century. And what happened was from the 8th through the 17th century, because woodblock printing technology was quite expensive, and since the country was dealing with a great deal of civil war, the only folks who were able to make woodblock prints were usually associated with a Buddhist organization that had the funds to do so. And what happened in the beginning of the 17th century, when the Tokugawa clan took control of the entire archipelago and established a military government in the city of Edo, which we now know as Tokyo. When that happened and the country settled into a state of domestic peace, when the economy started to stabilize, and when the government started to promote things like literacy through the establishment of public schools throughout the country. At that point, you start to see people interested in the pastime of reading. And that gives birth to the publishing industry and publishers who decide to invest money in this woodblock printing technology, and their investment is paid off very well because of all of this public interest. But of course, with the literacy rate in Japan at that time still rising,
Mhm.
People found that books that had illustrations were a lot easier to appreciate.
Right.
And so the earliest woodblock prints that we find are simply books filled with text.
Mhm.
But gradually, over the following decades, you see the introduction of illustrations, black and white illustrations,
Mhm.
and these images grow in size to the point where eventually publishers are making books that are essentially picture books.
Mhm.
And the text in those publications is actually quite minimal.
Mm.
And from there, we see the introduction of single sheet woodblock prints and folios of prints on a particular series. And as time passes, the technology improves. Uh, for example, the introduction of full color printing becomes
Mhm.
possible, and woodblock prints become much and much more visually lavish. But
Right.
back to your first question
Mhm.
about ukiyo-e and the distinction between that and woodblock printing.
Mhm.
As I uh, as I mentioned, ukiyo-e is more of a philosophy than
Mhm.
it is a medium like woodblock printmaking.
Right.
And that philosophy of ukiyo-e, which literally means pictures of the floating world,
Mhm.
uh, it it's a term that was coined by a an author during those early years of the 17th century, and it was a reaction against the very serious dour Buddhist content
Mhm.
of woodblock prints up until then.
Mm.
People who were finally living in domestic peace uh, were a bit exhausted by the constant discussion about Buddhism and the way in which a person can escape the suffering of
Mm.
war and the torments of human existence
Mhm.
through uh, Buddhist practice. Uh,
Right.
Instead, people became interested in uh, celebrating the pleasures of daily life, and especially now that they didn't have to worry so much about military conflicts, they didn't
Mhm.
have to worry about those sorts of dangers. They could pursue those pleasures, such as kabuki theater, which was sort of like it had the brash quality of early American vaudeville.
Uh-huh.
Or people wanted to indulge in domestic travel, which
Mhm.
for the previous centuries, again, because of war, wasn't possible.
Mhm.
And they were interested in images of beautiful women and beautiful men.
Yeah.
Uh, and that sort of secular, sort of hedonistic appreciation of daily life
Mhm.
is, and that depiction of daily life is what we refer to as ukiyo-e. Sometimes those pictures are done in the form of woodblock prints. Actually, sometimes they're done in paintings as well. But from the beginning of the 17th century until about the 1860s, for those 250 years, that time period is when what we refer to as ukiyo-e really flourished in Japan.
Yeah. So ukiyo-e, like you said, philosophy, a more kind of like the style and the themes, right? So it was like what the thing was about versus woodblock print is how you make it, right? Is that like kind of like a super simple explanation, I guess?
Yes, that's exactly right.
So
and regarding the woodblock prints and how you make it, that is in itself a really interesting discussion.
So usually, so for example, like I said, we're going to talk about the great wave of Hokusai in a little bit, but usually you just hear, this is Hokusai's, this is Hiroshige, this is Sharaku, this is you hear like one artist name, but it wasn't just one person by themselves producing these famous like artworks, right?
Exactly. Another very important point about ukiyo-e is that these works were made by a workshop within which the designer, such as Hiroshige or Hokusai, who you mentioned, were just one part of that large workshop. They were responsible for the design of the initial image, and they would draw out a sketch of, for example, the Great Wave. And from the point where they finished that design, their participation in the creation of the woodblock print was almost finished. The rest of the work continued with other people. For example, a carver would take that sketch of the Great Wave and glue it onto a piece of cherry wood, a block of cherry wood. He would then carve into the block, carving through the design, and would carve out everything except for the lines of the design. So that in the process of making this first wood block, which we call the key block, Hokusai's original drawing was destroyed. Something that's kind of ironic. We think so much about the importance of original artwork and the historical importance of the artist's first sketches. But sadly, this process of woodblock printmaking involved the destruction of that original drawing. But anyways, what we do have left is that woodblock, that key block, which is then covered with black ink and printed like a potato print multiple times. And then those prints, which is just, again, the black outline of the image that Hokusai made.
Almost like a line drawing, I guess it would be the ultimate result, right?
Exactly. And each of those, maybe the printer made 20 copies of that black line reproduction. Those pieces of paper would then in turn be glued onto, each of them would be glued onto a block of cherry wood and used to create uh, the various colors for the final image. What I mean by that, it's gets a little bit
Yeah, it's a little complicated.
complicated here. But if you can imagine the way that nowadays
Yeah,
we take a photograph
yeah.
and we use it to make a print,
Hmm.
um, we use something like Photoshop
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
take that photo
Yeah.
and to separate the colors.
Right.
For example, one way is to separate it into red, blue, and yellow,
Hmm.
um, or red, blue, and green.
Right, right.
Another way is to do it with cyan, um,
Is it magenta?
magenta, yellow, and black.
Right, CMYK, yes.
Uh,
Popular printing in Wasabi, we use CMYK, so
exactly.
yeah, yeah,
So how did people do it
yeah.
back in, for example, the 19th century? Uh, the the fact is, well, with CMYK,
Hmm.
you're able to take those three colors and black, and you're able to optically mix them together
Hmm.
because they're basically like dots, right? You're
Yeah.
able to optically mix them together so that you can get colors, secondary and tertiary colors,
Right.
like violet, right?
Hmm.
Uh, that wasn't possible with woodblock printmaking. So, for
Hmm.
example, in the case of the Great Wave, even though we refer to it as a basically monochromatic print, it's mostly blue, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Various shades of blue. Actually, that print requires the carving of somewhere between 10 to 20 different wood blocks
Mm.
because each shade of blue or each shade of gray or the other subtle colors like yellow that go largely unnoticed in the
Hmm.
production of that print. Each of those colors requires a separate woodblock that
Mm.
is uh, designated for that color, inked up with that color, and then in the final printing process, uh, used for the addition of that color to the print. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like the way that I think of it is kind of like stamps, right? It's like
Right.
each stamp has a slightly different color, and then when you mix them in the final product, they end up creating like these subtle gradations or these subtle hues that you're trying to get, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So a moment ago, I mentioned how after making the initial key block print,
Hmm.
the printer would print off about 20 different uh, impressions
Hmm.
of that outline and then glue those printed uh, papers to other wood blocks.
Hmm.
Uh, that's the reason why. Um, the the designer
Hmm.
Hokusai, in collaboration with the carver and the printer, had to in their heads
Hmm.
do that sort of color separation that we nowadays do
Wow.
mechanically with things like Photoshop. If you
Yeah.
can imagine how incredibly complicated that
Yeah.
must be to uh, uh, maybe take a sketch
Hmm.
and paint it with colors, but then look at that final product and decide, okay, this part here we're going to use for block number two. This
Right.
part over here that is a slightly lighter shade of blue we're going to create with block number three. on and on
Mm-hmm.
for, like I said, sometimes about 20 different blocks. That was the way in which those additional wood blocks were used. And then finally, when all of those were carved,
Mm-hmm.
the team would come together and sort of like an assembly line technique, print
Mm-hmm.
one color at a time, overlaying those colors until you have your final image.
Yeah, that's, I mean, so something I'm curious about. So, of course, the boom of ukiyo-e prints was in the Edo period. That is really the time of in Japan when it's associated with the ukiyo-e prints, which is like 1603 to like 1868, roughly.
Right.
Some people argue on that, but anyway, that's generally, I think, the accepted period. But the did do you know if like from the beginning until like when Hokusai was around, which was later in the like mid 1800s, so towards the end of that big time period of ukiyo-e, did
Yes.
it get more complicated? Did they get more like subtle hues and they were using like more blocks in order to like combine colors in more complicated ways? Was there like a progression in that way?
Yes, there was.
Oh, okay.
The first, as I mentioned
Mm-hmm.
earlier, the earliest uh, works of ukiyo-e were
Mm-hmm.
simply books
Mm-hmm.
that were black ink on paper,
Oh, okay,
and
okay.
and one of the reasons is because in terms of the use of color, that
Mm-hmm.
was the most sophisticated technology available at the time.
Mm-hmm.
When images, when those illustrations were added to the books, and when those illustrations gradually evolved into single sheet prints of their own. Again, these were black and white images that were sometimes colored by hand.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the, uh, the the dyes that were used were typically natural pigments,
Mm-hmm.
like dayflower for blue, and uh, lapis lazuli for green.
Mm-hmm.
These were sometimes quite uh, fugitive.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why when we display those prints, we uh, need to be careful not to display them for too long.
Mm.
Those colors were initially applied by hand,
Mhm.
and later on, artists found a way in which to do those wood blocks with color on them
Mhm.
and register those blocks so that they could be printed uh, perfectly where they were supposed to be.
Mm.
Uh, as you might find from an experiment of potato prints or something like that, uh, when you don't have any kind of registration system and you're printing a multicolor image several times,
Mhm.
each time the blue will be a little bit off kilter. Each
Right, right.
time the yellow will be a little bit over the lines.
Mhm.
Uh, but uh, eventually, uh, the artisans who made up this woodblock printing team devised a registration system
Mhm.
that could be used so that every woodblock fit exactly where it was supposed to, and every area of color uh, fit exactly between the lines, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and later technical developments involved, for example, the introduction of uh, longer lasting pigments. For
Right.
example, one very special quality about Hokusai's Great Wave
Mm-hmm.
is that it uses the color Prussian blue.
Mm-hmm.
And by that name, uh, we can tell that it was an imported dye.
Mm-hmm.
It was a color that was actually, through an accident,
Mm-hmm.
invented in a laboratory
Mm-hmm.
in Germany, in Prussia,
Mm-hmm.
and when the chemists who accidentally made that realized what a beautiful color it was, they started to market it internationally
Mm-hmm.
as a dye for fabrics and other printmaking.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, it was imported into Japan. And that is the reason why, at the time,
Mm-hmm.
Hokusai's Great Wave was such a phenomenal success. It
Mm.
involved this new technology, which I suppose, if we were to compare it to uh, things happening in the early 21st century, might
Mm-hmm.
be something similar to 3D movies
Right.
uh,
Right.
or virtual reality,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could keep asking you more and more and more about just ukiyo-e and woodblock prints in general, but since you brought up the Great Wave, let's focus in a little bit on that. So, first of all, that is going on display in September, I believe, at the museum. Is that right?
Right. So it's part of a series of rotations
Okay.
uh, that we started actually in February of
Mm-hmm.
this year. Uh, we decided that Hokusai's Great Wave is from a series of prints known as the 36 Views of Mount Fuji.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, a funny thing about that series is there's actually 46 prints in it.
I, that's interesting.
Hokusai uh, originally planned on making 36 prints, but in the
Uh-huh.
process of making it, because by that time he was so famous,
Yeah.
and because there was such public demand for his prints, that he decided to expand it.
Yeah.
So, among those 46 prints, we, since February, have just been displaying selections,
Mm-hmm.
one at a time,
Mm-hmm.
um, in a gallery where there's a lot of information about Hokusai's career,
Mm.
uh, information about that particular series, and images of each of the 46 prints in the series.
Mm-hmm.
So it's if you go to the museum at any time, really, it will be the rotations will continue until the beginning of September 2021.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to the museum and go to this gallery, which is located on the Diamond Head side of
Mm-hmm.
the museum, uh, uh, you can visit multiple times, and as long as you don't go too often,
Mm-hmm.
every time you go, you will see a new print on display, and
Mm-hmm.
you can enjoy it there in the flesh. So, like I said, one print every 2 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, uh, in September, uh, beginning September 17th and continuing until October 4th, we'll be displaying the Great Wave.
Wonderful. So just curiosity here, I was just struck by, since we were talking about that there's 46 prints, how many of those 46 does the museum have?
We have all of them.
Wow, that is cool.
The prints came to us from the author James Michener, who is famous for his book Tales of the South Pacific, which was later adapted into a musical by Roger and Hammerstein called South Pacific. Right, and that musical was then adapted into a Hollywood film. Anyways, from the commercial success of that book and its later incarnations, Michener began his collecting of woodblock prints and amassed what was at the time one of the largest collections of Japanese woodblock prints in the world. Yeah. He then, in the 1950s, he lived in Hawaii for a few years. He was doing research for his novel, Hawaii, and he realized at that time that this growing collection of fragile works on paper that he had were difficult to transport from city to city as he moved around during his career. He decided he needed to find a home for them, and since he was living in Hawaii, he decided to contact us at the museum. At that time, we were known as the Honolulu Academy of Arts, but he loaned us his print collection, and in the subsequent years, he sent us all of the additional prints that he collected. He became more and more passionate about this collecting, and even wrote nonfiction books about the history of woodblock prints. Yeah. And he was in many ways sort of a dream donor from a curator's point of view. Not only offering us this incredible collection of works, but throughout the course of his relationship with our museum, he actively sought out new prints that would help our collection and made it bigger and better.
That's wonderful. I mean, I think, in our second issue, we ran a story about the Michener collection. I got to talk to you about this even more in depth, and there's some wonderful little parts of that story that I just love. But it's just such a, I guess, kind of serendipitous thing that, it was able to come together in this way. And now Hawaii, Honolulu has access. People here have access to these like amazing works of art that otherwise we would not have. So yeah, that's wonderful.
We're very fortunate. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, to get to see, Hokusai and tons of the other stuff that you guys have, that's just amazing. There's one quick little question here that I was thinking. 46 views of Mount Fuji, right? So there are these 46 images of Mount Fuji. Were they sold as a book originally, or were they sold like one by one? Do you know how it got out into the world? Like what was the original idea behind that Hokusai made those prints?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question that for a lot of other prints, we don't know the the answer for.
Mm.
But since this series is so famous, there
Hmm.
has been quite a lot of research done about it.
Hmm.
Recently, the British Museum did a wonderful exhibition about Hokusai,
Right.
and in that show and in their catalog, they talked a bit about some of the ways in which the 36 views of Mount Fuji was advertised by
Hmm.
the publisher even before the prints were first
Interesting.
commercially available.
How
Uh,
were they advertised?
um, well, they were advertised as a complete set.
Ah,
I don't think at that time the publisher realized that it would grow to 46 images,
right.
uh, but um they talked about how this would be a series in which this volcano,
Hmm.
this sacred site in
Hmm.
Japan, would be depicted from various angles in various weather conditions
Hmm.
at various times of the year.
Wow.
Um, Beyond that, I don't think they gave many specifics,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
but eventually, I believe that the Great Wave was intended as uh, the first, or perhaps one of the first,
Hmm.
images in that series.
Mm.
So it seems like even at that time, Hokusai himself realized the importance of
Hmm.
this particular image,
Yeah, yeah.
and and really promoted it as a highlight within the series.
Mm.
Nowadays, of course, history has agreed with him,
Hmm.
and if you were to even look at your iPhone and send a text to
Hmm.
a friend, the Great Wave is one of only, I think, two works of world art
Yeah.
that are available uh, as emojis.
Right, right.
The other one being the Scream by Edvard Munch.
Interesting, interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, no, you shared a video with me that has so much more information regarding the Great Wave, and I will include a link in the description. It's a great video, a lot of great context, and also the influence that it had, after it came out in the following decades and 100 years or whatever. So I will include that in the description. But just one last question here. We've covered a lot of topics, and in my other interviews with you, I've covered a lot of topics. But something I've never really gotten to ask you is a little bit about you. And I was wondering, so you get to like deal with these like incredible pieces of art and do all these like figure out these incredible displays and all this stuff. But what would you say is like your favorite part of your job, or something that you really enjoy of what you get to do?
Well, one uh, one aspect of the job that I really enjoy is
Hmm.
when I am able to participate in some of the broader cultural conversations
Hmm.
that we in Hawaii, or we in the United States, or we as an international community are
Hmm.
having these days.
Yeah.
Uh, Sometimes I might feel like I'm in a bit of an ivory tower or
Hmm.
something, or I feel like my work is dealing with something that's slightly esoteric,
Hmm.
and that people might not see as intimately connected to their daily lives. Uh,
Right. Yeah.
but a project that I've been working on recently,
Hmm.
as an extension, a contemporary extension of traditional Japanese ukiyo-e,
Hmm.
is contemporary Japanese manga.
Mm.
And I've done a few exhibitions over the past few years
Hmm.
uh, that talk about different genres within that field of Japanese comic books.
Hmm.
Manga, I would say, is most easily translated into something like a comic book or a graphic novel.
Right.
Uh, uh, and the works of manga that I display in those exhibitions are uh, they're very important in terms of uh, art history.
Hmm.
They
Hmm.
are usually a bit more interesting visually and conceptually than the kind of manga that you might find at a bookstore or that you might find online.
Hmm.
Like any field of art,
Hmm.
manga has a great range of quality. And as a museum, we're trying to promote those works of Japanese graphic novels that are very thoughtful
Hmm.
and very aesthetically powerful.
Mm.
Uh, the most recent manga project that I've been involved with has focused on works by uh, women artists,
Hmm.
uh, and there's actually a field of a genre of manga that is dedicated to women's issues and that is marketed specifically to female readers.
Hmm.
There's a long history of what we call shoujo manga,
Hmm.
uh, comic books for young women.
Hmm.
Uh, and within about the past 30 years or so, out of that genre of girls manga, grew this uh, a type of manga that talked about issues concerning adult women,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, and that was intended for adult female readers.
Right.
The show that I'm working on now, we're not exactly sure when this show is going to be held, but hopefully within the coming years.
Yeah. Yeah.
The show is entitled Empowered: How Women Revolutionized Japanese Manga.
Mm.
This show will spotlight a group of contemporary female artists and the work that they've recently done.
Mm.
Also, the show will talk about some of the art historical context uh, from which they emerge, uh, including the history of shoujo manga
Mm.
and also works of early 20th century manga and earlier works of Japanese woodblock prints that deal with issues of gender and gender equality.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's a show that, in light of the recent international discussions about women's rights
Hmm.
and about women's equality, I think that it's a timely show. And it's very satisfying for me to be able to participate in
Hmm.
that conversation through this kind of work.
Yeah, no, it's cool like seeing the kind of historical context to this, right? Like these, whether it's modern manga or manga from 40 years ago or a manga-ish work from, that time period in the Edo period in the 1800s or something. Like this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Like there's things going on, there's inspiration there, there's purpose to the art many times. And so I when we get to have conversations, it's always fun learning those little pieces of context from you. So I always enjoy our chats.
Likewise, and I really appreciate all of your help in passing on to the public
My pleasure.
information about these conversations that we
Yeah.
have. I am learning as we go
Yeah.
about this subject,
Mhm.
and it's really a thrill to be able to present my findings to the public through your help.
Oh, thank you. So, of course, I will, like I said, I'll include the link and all that information in the description so people can go check out, the various woodblock prints of Hokusai, including the Great Wave, and stay up to date with, of course, future exhibits and all that. So, thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Take care.
All right.